Welcome to the Lagoon cassette of lateral thinking murder puzzles. We hope you enjoy this collection of baffling murder cases. Before you begin, I'll quickly tell you how to operate the tape. Officer Harry Schultz will recount each murder case for you to solve. At the end of each story, you'll be asked one or two questions about how Schultz reached his conclusion. You'll then have 30 seconds to think about what you've heard and come up with an answer. At the end of 30 seconds, you'll hear the answer to the question. 5 seconds before you hear the answer, you'll hear this sound. So if you need more time, you'll be able to press the pause button before the solution is revealed. Best of luck.
Allow me to introduce myself. The name is Harry Schultz. For my sins, I've spent the last 19 years up to my neck in the worst that the Big Apple has to offer. I'm a homicide cop for the NYPD, and there ain't much sleaze and violence that I don't get involved in. When there's a homicide in Manhattan, they dial my number. You could say after almost 20 years in the job, I'm tired of life. Tell you one thing, I sure as hell am tired of death. But I guess I've learned a thing or two about human nature. You'd be amazed at the lengths some people will go to get what they want, to get rid of who they want to, and to keep themselves off the suspect list. I spend my whole life sifting through phony evidence, questioning phony witnesses, to get to the truth behind the lies and the deceit. Tell you what, if you got a little while and, don't mind my saying, you look like you do, I could tell you about some of my more famous murder cases. You know, give you an idea of what we in the NYPD homicide are up against. If you like, we could make it a bit more interesting. What do you say we see if you can work out who committed the murders? Remember, I got a lot of years' hard experience behind me, but let's see if you have an ear for the important details. See if you can tell the diamonds from the garbage. See if you can spot a crooked witness or faked evidence. That kind of thing. Say, how about we give it an edge? Let's give you a time limit to solve the murders. How about 30 seconds? I reckon this could be kind of fun.
Internal Affairs.
New York's a dirty city, and murder is a dirty crime. But somebody's got to deal with it, and most of the time that someone is me. It was late, after midnight, and the rain was coming down like there was no tomorrow when I got the call. By the time I reached the scene, I was wetter than a trout in the Hudson River, and just about as cheerful. Krapovitz had beaten me there, which just made me madder. He knew this job was for us, and not the feds, but he just couldn't help sticking his goddamn nose into other people's business. In this case, mine. "What are you doing here, Krapovitz?" I shouted so as to be heard above the downpour. "Ambulance, Jason?"
Just doing your job for you, Schultz.
He replied.
I was in the area.
"Was that before or after you heard the call on the radio?" I asked, but it went straight over Krapovitz's stupid head.
Suicide, 3rd floor.
He told me, though I don't remember asking.
Shot himself in the head. Not pretty.
I pulled myself up the stairs, my clothes dragging me down, they were so wet. The building was cheap, mostly rented apartments, I guessed. The shabby stairwell was covered in graffiti. Looked like they hadn't seen a paintbrush in about 30 years, though it was hard to see just how bad things were, what with the 15-watt light bulbs that the cheap landlord had put everywhere. Panting heavily, I reached the 3rd floor. I didn't like to admit it, but maybe the boys were right. Maybe I did need to lose a few pounds. I pushed the door open and entered the apartment. I didn't have to ask which one it was. Krapovitz already had some goons there. My goons, as it turned out, from the station. "Hey!" I shouted. "How come you guys turn out so fast when Krapovitz calls?" Dorkins turned around. "A neighbor reported a gunshot. They called 911. Krapovitz was already coming down the stairs when we got here." The apartment was number 314 and was brighter than the stairwell, and cleaner too. The corpse was male, 50 to 55 years old and Caucasian. Around 5'11", I guessed. He was smartly dressed in gray pants and a check sport jacket with black shoes. That was all I could see. He was face down on the floor. The room looked like it had been used as an office. It had a desk, a nice one too. Files, bookcases, that kind of stuff. The stiff had a revolver in his right hand, and the right-hand side of his head, the side I could see, was a mess. The blood had run down his face and was staining the gray carpet in a crimson arc. The chair was pushed well back from the desk, at an angle. "Any note?" I asked Dorkins. He shook his head. "Keep looking. There'll be one somewhere." There always was. I must have seen 100 suicides, and there was always some kind of note. I stood between the body and the desk, where in my thinking he would have sat, because I guessed he would have written a last farewell from there. I don't know why, but I pressed the play button on the old dictaphone that lay on the top of the desk. I'd seen the model before. I used to have one just like it. We found the goodbye we were looking for straight away.
"I just can't stand it. I can't go on any longer."
I heard a frightened voice say, followed by a single shot and the sound of someone slumping to the floor. I studied the desk. There was a blotter in the center of the desk, but I couldn't make out any indentations from anything he'd written resting on it. He'd been a tidy man, though. Everything was neatly laid out. Papers in a tray top right. Telephone to the right of the blotter. The old dictaphone machine below it. Paper clips and bands in a little pot next to that. Old-fashioned ink pen and ink pot just to the left of the blotter, and a telephone notepad with a pencil still in the holder just to the left of that. Nothing looked like it had been disturbed or knocked around. No reason to suspect a struggle of any sort had taken place here. I studied the lights in the room. 2 lamps on desks, both on, and a central rose hanging from the ceiling turned off. I flicked the switch in the wall momentarily, on and off again, and the light flickered. "Dust the whole place, top to bottom for prints," I told Dorkins. "It's homicide. Oh, and pull Krapovitz's prints from the records," I added as an afterthought.
Why does Schultz suspect Krapovitz? What is it that makes him so sure it was murder and not suicide? Here's the solution to the puzzle. Schultz suspected Krapovitz because Krapovitz was already at the scene of the crime and was coming down the stairs when Dawkins and the other officers from the station arrived.
"Krapovitz was already coming down the stairs when we got here."
The NYPD homicide officers had responded promptly to the neighbor's 911 call. So how could Krapovitz have got there so fast? Especially when the 911 call would have automatically gone through to the NYPD rather than the feds. Unless, of course, Krapovitz was there already, which is what Schultz suspected. The layout of the desk was another point that Schultz picked up, which made him suspect foul play.
Old-fashioned ink pen and ink pot just to the left of the blotter, and a telephone notepad with a pencil still in the holder just to the left of that.
The victim was obviously left-handed, yet the gun was found in the victim's right hand, probably placed there by the murderer. The most important detail, though, was when Schultz pressed the play button on the dictaphone. Schultz immediately heard the victim's supposed suicide message and the fatal shot.
I don't know why, but I pressed the play button on the old dictaphone that lay on the top of the desk. We found the goodbye we were looking for straight away.
So, who rewound the tape? If it had been a suicide, the tape would have started from the end of the message, not the beginning. Dirty work.
My first ever case, and my least favorite arrest, was to do with two brothers, the Del Gordos. Tony Del Gordo I'd grown up with. I knew him well. We'd been like brothers until we reached 15. We'd gone to the same school, shared the same dates, fought each other's battles, and told our folks the same lies. Then Tony'd gone running off with some questionable gangs, shall we say, and we'd parted company. But we kept in touch. Tony sometimes trimmed his sails a bit close to the wind, but he just about managed to stay on the right side of the law. Then there was his brother, Frank. Frank I had never met. Their mother had died when they were both small, and they'd gone to live with two different aunts. Tony with his Aunt Louisa in the Bronx, and Frank with his Aunt Sissy in San Francisco. Though I'd never had the pleasure of meeting Frank face to face, never even seen a picture of him come to think, I knew about his reputation. Frank's reputation was big. In fact, Frank's reputation was huge. Where Tony had managed to toe the line, Frank had jumped over the edge. He'd started out as a small-time crook, but over the years, things had gotten worse. He was never gonna reform. It was a vicious circle. They put him in prison, he served his time, he came out and robbed some store, so they put him in prison again. When he got out again, guess what? He robbed a bank. And so it went on. There was a rumor that kept going around that Frank was connected. But in my experience, the mob had little trouble telling the difference between a sharp operator and a klutz like Frank. All the same, I was sorry the day the call came from San Francisco, saying that a woman had been found dead and that Frank Del Gordo was the one with the smoking gun. He was believed to be heading back to New York, probably to get help from his family. That's why they called me. No one in the station realized I knew his brother, and I kept it that way. I don't take my personal life to work with me. It just gets in the way. In the kind of business I'm in, you don't need added complications. So I got into the car and went looking for the wretched Frank. Somehow, I knew this wasn't gonna be difficult. I grew up with a lot of kids who, sure as night, were heading for a life of small-time crime. I knew how they worked, how they thought. As far as I knew, Tony hadn't met up with his brother in years, but he was my first port of call.
Hey, Harry, long time no see,
said Tony when he laid eyes on me. 5 years. My wedding, I reminded him.
Yeah, how's,
He hesitated. He was trying to remember my ex-wife's name. It was Tanya, but I just shook my head. He said he was sorry. I told him why I was calling, and from the look in his face, I could tell that he didn't know a thing.
Frank?
He said, and crumbled back into his easy chair, shaking his head back and forth, muttering, No, not little Frankie. The gray-haired old-timer sitting in front of me, sobbing his heart out, was not the Tony I remembered. He was a shadow of his former self and walked with a stick now, after being hit by a truck as he drunkenly tried to find his way back home one night. In his prime, Tony had worked for the Gianni Rimini, one of the richest property developers in Manhattan. Tony had been his right-hand man, his muscle, his fixer. I never liked to ask about the things he'd done for Rimini in those days. The professional side of me was happier not knowing. I left him in his apartment and cruised around the streets low down on the east side. I guessed that Frank would hit here before long, trawling the bars until he came across someone he knew. Someone who could get him a job, fix him up with somewhere to stay. Tony had told me that there was no family left except himself, so the Frisco cops had been wrong about that. He also said he was about the last person on Earth Frank would turn to if he was in the kind of trouble I said he was. There was no sign of him in any of the bars I checked, and I'd been into quite a few. I was just about to give up on my hunch and head back to the station when I saw a man get out of a car and walk across a dirty bit of land that some kids were playing ball on. Something about the way he walked, or maybe his build, made me look.
Hey, mister!
One of the kids shouted.
Throw us the ball!
A lone kick had caused the ball to shoot away from them past the man. As he turned to throw the ball back, I saw his face. I jumped out of the car, sprinted across the grass, and flattened poor Frank before he had a chance to so much as mutter. He was so shocked he didn't even try to resist. I cuffed his arms behind his back and dragged him to his feet.
Hey, mister! You a cop?
One of the kids yelled. They'd all crowded around to watch the action and were standing staring, open-mouthed. Another day of protecting and serving, I told them, and marched Frank across to the car.
Schultz had never met Frank Del Gordo, or seen so much as a picture of him. So how on earth did he manage to arrest the right man without even checking his name? Here's the solution to the puzzle. Schultz told you at the beginning of the story that he'd grown up with Tony Del Gordo. Schultz knew that Tony had a brother, Frank, although he'd never met him. What Schultz failed to mention in his story was that Tony and Frank were identical twins. Schultz recognized Frank from a distance because the way he walked and his build reminded him so much of the way his friend Tony used to look.
Something about the way he walked, or maybe his build, made me look.
But there was no way that Schultz could have been in any danger of mistaking Tony for Frank, because Tony now walked with a stick following his accident several years ago.
He was a shadow of his former self and walked with a stick now.
From a distance, Frank looked exactly the same as Tony had done before his accident. An Englishman expires.
Jimmy's place, as you've probably already gathered by now, has little to recommend it. I mean, look around you. It's dark, dull, and smoky at the best of times. And Jimmy himself is to bartending what Fidel Castro is to ballet. But it's quiet and predictable. And after a day in New York City, peaceful predictability is what I need. Anyway, one stormy evening last summer, I've been drinking here at Jimmy's bar, and I wasn't pleased when a call came through. I finished my beer, said goodbye to the sultry blonde I'd been trying to kickstart, and made my way to Park Avenue, home of the rich, the famous, and tonight, the dead. I waved down a cab. and as the driver weaved his way through the crawling traffic, I cursed my luck for being called out on such a foul night. But the call had come from Pinsker, a good patrol cop. Unlike most of his kind, Bud Pinsker had a big enough brain to figure out when I needed a call and when I didn't. He hadn't been wrong before, so I guessed he wasn't wrong now. Pinsker stood on the sidewalk looking worried as the cab pulled up. As I crossed the road, a car screeched by, splashing my newly pressed pants. Cursing loudly, I raised my fist and shook it at the big black Cadillac speeding off into the distance. I reckon the car must have been traveling at 60 miles an hour, but I still managed to catch a glimpse of the driver. I had only seen a flash of his face in the rear-view mirror, but there was no mistaking that sneer. It belonged to Tommy Lagarda, one of New York's mafiosi and one of the state's most wanted men. As I wandered over to where Pinsker was standing, I wondered what a sleazeball like Lagarda was doing in this part of town.
Shooting on the first floor.
Pinsker said, without preamble, bringing me back to the case in hand.
Jeffrey Jones, a limey. No Mrs. Jones recorded at this address. Big deal,
I barked, my opinion of Pinsker taking a nosedive.
So a foreigner living alone gets wasted and you call me on my night off? It's not just any foreigner, sir,
he told me.
It's the Jeffrey Jones.
I'd heard about Jeffrey Jones, or at least I'd read about him. He was one of the richest 500 men in America, a hotshot property developer in Manhattan. And as Pinsker had already figured, you don't get to be a hotshot anything in New York City unless you know some pretty heavy hitters, or you've slept with the mayor. Pinsker told me that the limey had been shot. An old lady from next door at 9931 had heard the gunfire while out walking her Pekingese. She called the police at about the same time as someone from Jones' house. He wasn't sure who. The woman, a 73-year-old divorcee going by the fancy name of the Countess Marguerite Luella de Mar, had heard the shot around 9 o'clock. Like I said, it was summer, and according to the little lady, some of her neighbors' windows had been open when she walked past, and she'd heard Jones shout,
Arthur, what on earth are you doing?
She said she knew it was Jones because of his accent and heard the shot immediately after that, but didn't see anyone run out of the house. A patrol car had been passing at the time. For once, the cops were in the right place at the right time. They went straight in through the unlocked front door and found 3 of Jones's staff in the house.
They're waiting in there for you,
Pinsker said.
His driver, his bodyguard, and his butler, believe it or not. The patrol are fairly sure that no one had time to get out of the house before they arrived.
I braced myself for the sickening sight of yet another corpse and climbed the 3 or 4 steps into the house. I walked into a room that stood immediately to the left of the entrance hall, overlooking the street. Jones lay crumpled on the floor, his head towards the window, face exposed, legs half hidden beneath the writing desk. It looked kind of like he'd been standing behind the desk when he was shot, the force of the bullet knocking him backwards as he fell. His face registered only shock, not pain. I removed his glasses and closed the eyelids. He'd been hit in the chest. A large red stain was soaking through his English tweed waistcoat, around the point of the bullet's entry. The gun lay on the floor close to the body. A small, easily concealed German-made pistol of a type I'd not seen before. I smelt the weapon through force of habit. It had been fired recently. On the other side of the body lay another pair of glasses with one broken lens. The curtains were not drawn, and one of the windows was slightly open, allowing a refreshing breeze and some of the sounds of the avenue to echo around the room. Running an expert eye around, I took in a comfortable-looking 3-seater sofa and 2 deeply upholstered reading chairs, arranged around a huge, handsome fireplace with a gray-green marble surround. A small coffee table stood behind the sofa. Although I lay no great claims to knowing anything about interior decorating, it seemed oddly placed to me, marooned in an otherwise empty space. I saw from the indentations in the carpet that it had previously rested 2 feet further into the room, away from the windows, and had only recently been moved, though I couldn't figure out why that should be so. In the trash bin, I found a crumpled sheet of paper. I reached down to pick up what turned out to be a letter written by the deceased. The contents simply baffled me further. This is what it said. Count Leopold Luella de Mar, 9931 Park Avenue, August 28th. Having exchanged contracts on the above-mentioned property, 9931 Park Avenue, with the owner, Max McGinty, you and your wife have 30 days from today to evacuate the property. I wish to thank you in advance for your cooperation. Signed, Jeffrey Jones, Jones Conglomerates Incorporated. I put the letter into my pocket and turned to face the Englishman's staff, who Pinsker had rounded up and brought into the study. The driver was sitting in the armchair nearest to the window. You could tell by the full chauffeur's uniform, including driving gloves and cap. The butler, easily recognized by his manner, if nothing else, was standing stiffly by the fireside, as if waiting further instructions from his master. He'd been brought over from England by Jones, as if you needed telling. The third of the group, the bodyguard I assumed, sat at the far end of the sofa, looking frightened and shocked. I've seen a lot of guilty people in my time, and a few innocent ones too, and if nothing else, I know that there's no way to tell the difference just by looking at them. But in this case, it was different. I didn't feel like playing Hercule Poirot, making everyone listen to my theories, so I just walked up to the butler, took him by the arm, and led him out to the car.
Schultz had indeed arrested the murderer, but how had he been so certain about who to arrest without needing to ask any questions? What had he seen which implicated the butler? Here's the solution to the puzzle. This would be an easy one to answer had you been at the scene of the crime. Schultz described the 3 suspects in quite a cunning way. Although he says that usually there's no way to tell the difference between guilty and innocent people just by looking at them, this time he was able to. I'll tell you how. From the neighbour's testimony, Schultz could be fairly sure that it was Arthur who'd fired the shot.
Arthur, what on earth are you doing?
The reason Schultz was able to identify the butler as Arthur was because both Jones's driver and his bodyguard were female. If you listen carefully, you'll notice that Schultz doesn't mention the sex of the driver or the bodyguard in his description of them.
The driver was sitting in the armchair nearest to the window. You could tell by the full chauffeur's uniform. The butler, easily recognized by his manner, if nothing else, was standing stiffly by the fireside. The third of the group, the bodyguard I assumed, sat at the far end of the sofa, looking frightened and shocked.
Running scared.
You know, they say an alcoholic is someone who drinks more than their doctor. I've never met a doctor who could drink as much as me, so I guess I got a problem. Still, I guess you can have worse problems than mine. Anyway, let's get on with this next case. It was a sunny Sunday morning last fall, and I'd pulled up at Central Park. I decided to take in some of the smoggy city air to try and get rid of the fog that lingered in my head, courtesy of too much drink the night before. And the night before that, and the one before that, too. Never straying far from the car, I was trying hard not to get mowed down by the crazy rollerbladers, the mad cyclists, and the endless stream of marching activists. Central Park on a Sunday is more dangerous than Fifth Avenue on any day of the week. At least the taxi drivers on Fifth Avenue have some kind of control over their vehicles. I just started thinking about my daughter when the car radio crackled. It always seemed to happen that way. It was Dorkins at the station. They had a suspect in for an interview. And although it wasn't a homicide case, there was something about the setup that made Dorkins think that maybe I should get involved. That, at least, was something of a surprise. Not the homicide, but the news that Dorkins was actually thinking. He was assigned to assist me, to ride with me, and I didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. My theory is that Dorkins has the right number of brain cells. It's just that they're not connected up in any way. But he's pleasant enough to have around, and he's good with a gun, so I could have done worse. By the time I got down to the precinct, the weather had turned nasty. Big black clouds rolled in from New Jersey, and some fat blobs of rain started hitting the windscreen just as I pulled up to the curb and parked illegally. One of the best parts about being a cop in New York, you can park in no waiting zones. Hey, big deal. After the 20-yard sprint from the car to the front entrance of the station, I was as wet as one of the stiffs we sometimes pull from the East River. The rain had gone through my coat, my jacket, my shirt. I could feel them sticking to my shoulders. Ugh. The guy was in the interview room. I stood looking at him through the blind. He was about 35, weedy looking, smoking a cigarette and biting his fingernails. He looked nervous, but no more jittery than you or I would if we'd been dragged in by the homicide squad. His name was Dick Arnold, and he was a high school teacher. He'd called 911 at 7:30 this morning, having woken up to find his wife dead in the bed beside him.
Or so he says,
said Dorkins. He'd had a bad day. The wife was older than him, 52, a teacher at the same school. She had something of a weight problem, Dorkins told me with a smirk. It seemed that the paramedics had some difficulty getting the body out of the house. The beat cops who turned up at Arnold's door didn't find anything to suggest foul play, but something had made them twitchy about the case. So, not wanting to be suspected of going soft or anything, they cuffed him, dragged him down to the station, and handed him over to us. All this to a man whose wife had just died in her sleep. "What the hell is he doing here?" I asked, no one in particular, and went into the room. I gave him my condolences and apologized to him for the over-eager behavior of the boys in blue. I explained that since he was here, I was going to have to make a report. So he was going to have to tell me what happened, but if we made it short and snappy, I'd release him and have one of the patrol cars take him home. Here's what he told me.
We went to bed at about 11,
he began.
Me and Patricia both read for a while. Pat's been having trouble sleeping lately, so she likes to read as long as she can. She was reading one of those horror books, and I kept telling her she shouldn't, like it wasn't good for her.
The guy paused, and then went on to say,
And then it happened. She had that nightmare again. She's been having a lot of nightmares recently, though they're all different. They absolutely terrify her. Poor girl. She wasn't in the best of health, She hardly ate anything, but she weighed quite a lot and couldn't seem to lose weight. The doctor had told her, I think, that she was looking to have a heart attack if she didn't exercise some, but she didn't anyway. I think she had a fear of exercise or something, or maybe just a fear of ridicule, girls. I think she could see herself jogging down the sidewalk and all the neighborhood kids jeering and laughing at her.
The guy paused for breath and then continued.
So, like I said, she had this nightmare. This time, she was running down the freeway faster and faster, and one of those big, huge trucks was bearing down behind her.
He took another cigarette from the packet and lit it, and then carried on with his story.
At first, he says, when she looked back, she could see the whole truck. Then she could only see the metal grill, and then just a fender. And then it got closer and closer until finally it slammed into her back and everything went black.
The guy stopped. He took a deep drag on his cigarette and said,
At that point, I guess her heart just gave out. What with the shock and all, and all that.
He stopped and wiped his eyes. I looked away to give the poor man a bit of privacy. While looking around the room, my eyes caught a number on the back of the matchbox, which Arnold had been using. I scribbled the number down, passed it to Dorkins, and asked him to run a check on it.
I'd been telling her for some months now that she really should listen to the doctors and get fit or something. I'd been expecting something like this to happen for a long time. I can't pretend it's a surprise, but it's still such a shock, sir.
He paused, and his eyes glazed over with the memory of what he was recounting.
You know,
He said,
we were out in Central Park a couple of weeks ago, and we just walked in from the lake across Madison Avenue. It's not like it's a huge distance, and Pat had to sit on one of the benches for half an hour to get her breath back.
Arnold slammed his fist down onto his knee.
I should have known then,
He said with emotion.
I should have put her in the car and taken her straight to the hospital. I don't know how I'll ever forgive myself.
He stopped talking for a while and just stared at the wall. I excused myself and left the interview room in search of Dorkins. I found him in the refreshment canteen, tucking into a round of donuts. He looked like a cat that had caught a mouse and eaten all the cream and done it all on a Friday night on an expense account. He waved the phone number at me. "Got it, boss," he said. "Number belongs to a certain lady of the night who's all too familiar with the comforts of a police cell. Goes by the name of Saucy Sue. Real name of Susan Delaney. She's been busted maybe 5 times in the past 6 months. She said she'd been seeing Arnold on and off for the best part of a year." I picked up one of the donuts and sank my teeth into it. After chewing for several seconds, I'd made up my mind. I told Dorkins that we'd be holding Arnold a while longer, that I wanted to talk to the woman's doctor, and that I wanted an autopsy done on the body. I had a horrible feeling that the beat cops were right and I'd been wrong. We had another murder on our hands.
Why had Schultz changed his mind about Arnold? Surely being unfaithful didn't necessarily mean he was the murderer. Or was there something else that didn't quite stack up? Here's the solution to the puzzle. Schultz's suspicions had been raised when the husband went to great and unnecessary lengths to stress how unfit his wife was and how she'd been expected to have a heart attack. Arnold then went into great detail about the nightmare that his wife had had that had supposedly caused her heart to give out. However, Arnold had originally said that he'd found her dead in bed beside him in the morning.
He'd called 911 at 7:30 this morning, having woken up to find his wife dead in the bed beside him.
In which case, there's no way he could have known what she'd been dreaming about. As for Arnold being unfaithful, this didn't really have anything to do with the murder. It was one of the many red herrings that Schultz encounters in his investigations.